Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 274, and we're going to talk about my own personal road to libertarianism. I was asked by someone else to talk about this, but to put it in writing. And since pretty much 90% of what I'm doing these days is oral, I think I've decided that it might be a little bit easier to write if I first sort of gave a broad overview orally first. So my journey, which ended up with this label, libertarian, started with a quest to understand personal racial identity. I was born in the 1960s, and in those days, racism was interesting, right? It wasn't something that you hid. I mean, if you didn't like someone because of the color of their skin, you just basically told that person, and people told me very frequently as a young child growing up in the hood, as they say, uh, that I was different, that I was somehow, not accepted in society because of the way that I looked. And, it got a little bit rough. So we had to move out to the suburbs. And the shock that I encountered was that in the suburbs, you weren't allowed to use racial slurs or to even point out the difference in ethnicity in other people. And I thought that was really, uh, it was mind-bendingly confusing, especially since I was in fifth grade at the time. And up until that point, I was called Chink so often. I thought that was kind of like my middle name. Ha ha, little joke. But then going out to the suburbs, to even sort of bring up the topic that I was Asian, couldn't be a serious discussion. It had to be something lighthearted. In other words, you certainly didn't insult someone because of the basis of their race. Well, that of course changed when we got to high school, because then all the different neighborhoods in that school district came to the same high school. And, the familiar patterns of racial slurs, came back again. But, for that period of time where, people were telling me, no, 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 you're not a Chink, you're an American, it was very interesting, which, forced me to have to realize that this was something significant in my life. It wasn't something that you can just say, oh, it's a nothing. It's something that always came up. And when I was in college, there were a couple other incidents which made me realize that this sort of problem, I'll say, or this question of identity is something that just simply would not go away. I went to seminary, and there, no surprise, the theology there was taught with a Anglo-American subjectivity. So race just simply did not come up. No matter what class you took, race wasn't an issue. And so I thought it was very interesting. And most people by that time, especially even Koreans at the time, started adopting the assimilationist understanding of immigrants adapting to life in America. And I thought this was kind of interesting because, you know, most of the people who were, pushing that idea were people who had come over from Korea, so their English was not perfect. English was not their first language. And so to hear them say that people like me would be assimilated into the United States kind of was something like, oh, yeah, yeah, okay, sure. But then, of course, I knew that that's not something that would happen, at least not in the way that they were thinking. And so the question came up to me, what was the justification for an ethnic church in America? And, from my theological training, to become a pastor, there was nothing there. And in fact, if you were anything like I was, which was rebellious, against my parents, then this was my ticket to be free of my parents, to be sort of, come out from underneath their authority. And as much as I wanted that, I realized that it was problematic. Like I knew myself enough to know that I was pretty much an idiot, and to be left alone to my own devices would be something much more negative than positive. And so there was the faith component, which always nagged me in the back of my head. Like I wanted to know what was the right, correct practice, the way of living life that was acceptable to God. In other words, what was moral? What was the right thing to do? And I was obsessed with that. Like, what is the right thing to do? Especially if you're given responsibility of teaching younger kids, what do I teach them? What do I tell them is the right way of doing anything? And because my father was a pastor, I knew that there was a lot of politicking, there was a lot of shenanigans behind closed doors in the church, right? And so a lot of people would like to project a life of faithful devotion to God, but in reality, it was not always the case. And so, in order to answer some of these questions, I went to Korea, right? And so, in other words, I couldn't take the easy way out. I couldn't justify breaking free of my parents. And so I just simply got away. I went to Korea for 3 years. And after I came back, I realized, and I didn't come back once in the 3 years. I lived there for 3 years straight. And when I came back, I saw the world in a different place. The United States, I could see, was different. And somehow in those 3 years, I started thinking and seeing things from an Asian, more specifically, a South Korean perspective. And so the assumption of North American interpretation and subjectivity, particularly of theology and scripture, was basically normal and therefore correct, became obvious to me, right? So, not that it's wrong, but it's subjective. And it didn't necessarily mean that an Asian or a Korean perspective was wrong. It was just simply subjective. So I continued asking the questions, but by this time I was in a PhD program, uh, grad school. And, after struggling to figure out what to write about, a professor finally told me, why don't you just study what you always obsess about, something that means the most to you. And so I decided to focus on identity issues in the Korean church in North America. And so eventually I had to use race theory as the approach to study it, right? So I wasn't in a Christian school, grad school. I was not in a seminary. And so therefore I had to use a different approach, a non-church Christian approach in trying to analyze what was going on in the church. So I used race theory. And even though I used race theory itself is very subjective. You can read 100 books on race, and each book will have a different subjectivity on the topic of race. And so, whose subjectivity was the right one? And that was a nagging question for me until I read Howard Wynett and Michael Omi's Racial Formation. And their race theory was a race theory on race theories, which I loved because it did kind of explain why there were so many different subjectivities and interpretations of race. And I just simply took that to its logical conclusion. I had an email exchange with Howard Wynett, and he didn't necessarily like what I was doing with his idea, but too bad. And I basically used his theory consistently without any kind of prejudice that is leaning towards a certain conclusion. And what I realized was that everyone, from their own subjective point of view is going to experience and see race differently. But where does it take you? I didn't know where to go with it. But I did manage to finish my dissertation, got my PhD, and I was given a teaching assignment to teach racial justice. And I basically took my grad school reading list and assigned it to my undergrads. That's generally what most profs do. They take what they know and they start teaching it to their students. And I was frequently challenged by a lot of my students, the same questions that were running through my mind about exceptions, or as race theorists would say, the margin, right? People who are not normal, so-called. And so what do you say about the exception to the rule or the margins of the discussion? And I thought that was really interesting because race theory, as I learned it, started with a defense of the minority. But in order to make the conclusions that they wanted to make, you had to ignore other minorities. And it was justified by saying, well, those are bad people. So it's okay to exclude or marginalize certain people for the sake of this vast majority. And I thought that was kind of interesting, almost hypocritical, that you began uh, your work, your academic work, in defense of minorities, but your conclusion was we have to discriminate against other minorities. And that was hypocritical. And hypocrisy had always been, ever since the 90s, and by this time we're in the 2000s, right? So, uh, when one of my students, who was seventh grade at the time, accused me of hypocrisy, and he was right. And so ever since then, I sort of had this principle to make sure that I was never hypocritical again, which is really tough because once you realize what hypocrisy is, which is simply a double standard, then you realize that pretty much hypocrisy is in every aspect of your life. But nevertheless, I, had that going through my head. And so when students would point out double standards in the readings, I affirmed their critique and said, yes, this is why it cannot be the one theory which rules them all kind of thing. And so I was in this conundrum for a couple of years when I stumbled on Milton and Rose Friedman's Free to Choose. The one of the classes that I taught changed its reading list, and I had to choose different books to teach. And one of the choices was Free to Choose. And honestly, this is the level of my thinking. I didn't know who these people were, but it had free in the title, so it can't be all that bad. And of course, I've talked about this before. It blew me away, and I started teaching free to choose in all of my classes, right? And if it wasn't directly, it was always implied, especially through the no hypocrisy clause, which I have included now in all of my podcast episodes, right? And so Friedman is free to choose, and it's not like I did a lot of reading. Videos were my thing. And so I would just watch YouTube videos of Milton Friedman all day long, literally all day long. And I would watch them, rewatch them, really try to understand what he was basically trying to say. I didn't do any of the math, but it was all the theory that turned me on. And early, his description of the lead pencil, which I've done a couple episodes on this channel, blew me away, right? Because it answered all of the questions I had with regard to race. In other words, I was still struggling with the identity question. Even by this time, I was, I think I was, oh, yeah, I was in my late 30s by this time, and I was still struggling with the identity issue. And so after watching all these videos, I started saying, okay, well, let's see what else is out there. And I've stumbled on a interview that John Stossel did with Ron Paul. Now, the video was from 2007, but I was seeing it for the first time in 2010, 2011. So a few years after his, um, I guess in the grand scheme of things, his second presidential run, second of three. So when I saw it, again, blown away. And I remember coming home, I was really excited, and I told my wife, I said, I think we're libertarians. And she said, Oh, what's that? And I said, I don't know yet. I'll get back to her. I'll get back to you. And so I heard the concept libertarian, that it was attributed to Ron Paul. And, Ron Paul's ideas excited me, right? This was, I basically, you know, had a field day making fun of politicians because they were always contradicting themselves. They were always being hypocritical. And so it was a lot of fun making fun of them in class. But then Ron Paul was that person who wasn't hypocritical, who actually voted and conducted himself in a manner that did not contradict what he said. And so then I became fascinated with Ron Paul, who put into action, I mean, real life. It wasn't just theory, it was putting into action in Congress these ideas of freedom and not devolving into hypocrisy. And so, you know, that that's basically how I got to the concept of libertarian. But am I a left libertarian, right libertarian, Christian libertarian? No, I'm actually what I would call a purist in a sense that I'm libertarian. That is, I'm pro-freedom. In my earlier episodes on this channel, you'll see that I have a reset perspective episode. And what I do there is I redefine words in a way that it's not exclusionary, but inclusionary, if I can make up that word, that is inclusive of all related ideas. And part of that theory is that once you have this broad, all-inclusive definition, when anyone tries to narrow the scope of that term, of that label, then you see that they are doing work. They are trying to create a pathway to a certain conclusion, right? And so, therefore, it is no longer pure in the sense of what libertarian, that is to be free, is supposed to mean. And I relate this to the marketplace, right, where people are buying and selling things. So anytime you try to narrow the definition or the scope of a term like libertarian, essentially what you're doing is you're trying to control the market. You're trying to limit the choices from which people can choose. You're going to try to somehow regulate that certain interpretations and applications are wrong and others are better or correct. And so I don't advocate for that. If you want to call yourself left libertarian, okay, but I understand that by labeling yourself in such a way, then you see certain ideas as not good, and that your ideas are somehow superior. No, I don't. I don't do that. I mean, I have my own personal, favorites, personal beliefs, personal opinions, but freedom for everybody is always going to be the rule of the day. Freedom with responsibility. And this is the only way that you can maintain competition with ideas or competitions between ideas, right? So ideas have to compete with each other so that people can figure out what is the best for that person, for that individual subjectivity. And what that person decides may probably be something which is horrible to somebody else, but it doesn't matter because it's what that person has decided is best for themselves. And so take this approach and apply it to church life, to scripture. Well, what church is legitimate? What church is illegitimate? What is biblical? What is not biblical, again, it's the same phenomena. You are going to try to restrict, you're going to try to impose your own subjectivity on everybody else. And so, for my part, with this subjectivity, that freedom is the operating principle. But because I am someone who had my personal experiences, my racial experiences, my ethnic experiences that I had over my life, it will change. It will shift my subjectivity to see that certain interpretations might be less favorable at this given moment, at this current point in time than others. And I just simply share that. But at the end of the day, what a person will choose to do is going to be on that person. So, in this broad marketplace idea, yeah, that exists in seminary, that exists in theology, that exists in the church. Oops, sorry. And so in this way, one has to realize your own subjectivity. Sorry, that was a call from my mom. I had to take it. But anyway, as I was saying, ideas have to compete. And so it is not a pre-understood, like we're not going to bias a moral conclusion. Rather, it's through the competition of ideas and the competition of even interpretation that we discover what is moral. And that's not to say that murder will somehow be acceptable. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the everyday practices that we engage in, what is the best choice? What is the way that a person should conduct themselves is going to be always in flux because society is changing, time is changing, our subjectivity is constantly changing. And so we have to constantly discover and rediscover what is moral. And what we decide is moral is going to be subjective, right? So going back to what I said before, if you're, using a North American, Anglo-American perspective, subjectivity, then your conclusions are going to be different from someone who, you know, uh, embraces their Asian subjectivity on top of or somehow influencing that Anglo-American subjectivity. Something like me, grew up in America, always has lots of questions, went to Korea, realizing that is not completely, you know, perfect over there as well, but somehow coming to a better understanding of how to navigate life here in the United States. And I think so far, it seems, at least with my kids, they don't wrestle with the same questions that I did when I was younger. And so I think I was able to answer those questions sufficiently so that they didn't have to grasp or wrestle with those issues. They just have different problems now. Right. And so when we go back and we try to understand our lives or even try to understand scripture as it applies and how it might be relevant for our lives, well, there is always the danger of contextualization, of reading in our own subjectivity into what we want the text to say. And so I always go back with, well, how do people decide? Well, does it work? Right? So does your interpretation work? Does it resolve the questions to your satisfaction, even if it is only to satisfy a temporary desire that you might have, especially if you're younger and you want to explore things, right? So, well, this approach continually also forces us to check and recheck how we understand the world, how we understand ourselves in the world, how well our choices are working out for us. And this constant checking and rechecking is part of life, right? And that's how at least libertarianism, or at least the ideas of freedom, come to affect me every day of my life. And so hopefully sharing this with you helped me to put it in writing a little bit easier, and maybe even sort of bring some perspective in the way that you see life in the United States today, particularly when it comes to immigration or migration theory, and people, what they need to do in order to adjust to living in a different space with different rules and different people. But that's it for today. I will talk to you guys next time.